Welcome to DarshanTalks, powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm here with the ever popular Ish, and I'm going to let Ish introduce himself, but he's been on with us before. We're going to talk about negotiating clinical trial agreements. I think the conversation we're going to have today is just clinical trial agreements in general. What are they? Why do they matter? Why do we need to have them? And why are they such a pain in the butt when you are negotiating them? But before we get started, Ish, do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Darshan, as always. Istvan Fekete, feel free to call me Ish. Been negotiating clinical trials for over 10 years now. Started off running the contracts team at well, I didn't start off, but ran the contracts team at the University of Chicago for a number of years. And now I work for Huron Consulting, where we offer clinical trial negotiation services to universities and academic medical centers.
So Ish, you have a ton of experience with clinical trial agreements, and primarily from the investigator side. Is that accurate?
That's correct. Yeah, from the site side. Absolutely.
So overall, do sites feel that you even need a CTA? Or do we feel as a site that they are more slanted towards sponsors and maybe it's best to just get away from CTAs?
I would think from a site perspective, they do want CTAs, and it's really, around the concepts of indemnification and subject injury. They want to be shielded from the risk of running the sponsors' protocols. Yes, we talk about a lot of other things like publication and data rights and intellectual property, but the truth of the matter is how often are PIs independently publishing on industry-sponsored clinical trial agreements? Not often. Most of the times when they publish, they're an author on the multi-site. How many patents are being filed on IP coming out of industry-sponsored clinical trial? Almost none, And so we talk about these things, but I think the primary driver from the site perspective is the protection from the risk of conducting the trial.
That's a really good point. I think people tend to forget that it's not just about the IP. People tend to go, it's a protective mechanism. And I love how you're putting that out. As a person who represents sites, but also sponsors and CROs, I see the exact opposite side of the discussion when I am talking to sponsors. They are focused on the IP. They're worried about the IP. That's the entire basis of their company. A lot of the other stuff, like your protocol and the like, will protect exactly what's supposed to happen and the limits of indemnification. But indemnification is not the primary driver of the CTA. So I love that what we're talking about is it's really a compromise document. And the idea being the site needs to have its protections in place while the sponsor's coming in with their own protections. Are you seeing the use of more and more sponsor templates, or are you seeing more CRO templates that are being used nowadays?
It's a great question. And I think the way I would answer it is the major pharmaceutical companies are still using their own templates. But if you look at the industry as a whole, because there's when I talk about the major pharmaceutical companies, I'm talking about like the top 10 in the world, right? And outside of that top 10, you'll see more CRO templates than you will see sponsor templates.
So that raises the question. I mean, if you've bought a house anytime in the recent past, or even a while ago, the big thing is using the standardized templates that they have for selling a house, and you're not negotiating too much. The terms are the terms. You can add stuff to it, but for the most part, most of the contracts negotiated. I find myself still using my own sort of non-National Association of Realtor agreement, but that's more the exception than the rule, I would argue. In the same way, Magi, ACTA have all put out some templates around what is a quote unquote fair agreement for the site and the sponsor to have. You and I presented at Magi not that long ago, and we talked a little bit about the Magi template. What is your opinion on templates? Is that something sites are open to using, or is it too much of a compromise document?
I think sites are open to using it for sure, both the ACTA and the Magi template. I think ACTA is more widely adopted on the site side and probably on the pharma side as well. And there are a lot of sites who will take the ACTA with no changes. And, I've worked with the ACTA a lot. I think it's a good agreement. I think it strikes a fair balance and doesn't overcomplicate the issues, and I would say the same about Magi. There's part of me that feels like everybody just adopts those templates and I don't need to have a job anymore, because what invariably happens when you start with a different template is, where are you negotiating to? You're negotiating to what these templates already say. And yes, may you end up with some nuances, of course, but it's basically, the way I think about this industry is, we've created the box that things are supposed to fit in, and then people want to get creative and they go outside of the box, and we try to bring them back into the box, so to speak. That's a lot of what I think these negotiations end up being.
I should emphasize that I am a little bit biased in this situation. I wrote the last Magi template agreement version, so I should put that disclaimer out there. But or at least I was the last person whose hands were on it. So as far as I know, things could have changed or anything, but that's my recollection. So to the extent
I will say, Darshan, to give you a pat on the back, I think the Magi template now is much better than when I went to Magi 10 years ago for the first time. So there you go.
I'll take it for sure. And I think it's actually due for a little bit of an update again. There have been several changes that I would say we aren't talking about, things like privacy, things like data ownership. I mean, I don't think the version I worked on all those years ago includes all of those new updates that probably should be in there. So that's a call out to Magi. Let's talk a little bit more about that. But this is perfect. So let's talk a little bit about the types of clinical trial agreements. And the big question that before we go into the types, we should talk a little bit about why we need them. And you talked about this box. Do you find yourself coming back to the agreement over and over again, or is it one of those insurance policy type documents where you go, I have it if I need it, but the 99.9% of the time I'm never looking at it again?
I mean, after execution,
yeah,
right, you're very rarely looking at the contract outside of the budget and payment mechanisms, right? The budget and payment mechanisms is something that is regularly looked at, just because that pertains more directly to the logistics of running the trial.
Yeah.
But the contract itself, why do we enter into contracts? Contracts only matter if something goes wrong, right? If everything is going correctly and nobody's upset with anybody, right? And everybody's doing what they should, what the contract says, nobody cares about. The contract is meant to put the rules of the road in place so that if there is something wrong, how that is supposed to be addressed is already addressed in the contract. So from that perspective, no, people are not going back to the contract frequently after execution.
So two parts to that. So the first thing you mentioned is that people keep coming back to the budget and payment mechanisms. Do you typically find them in the contract itself, in the clinical trial agreement itself, or is it typically an attachment or a separate document, if you will, that's being used? So is it the same CTA that's being pulled up, or just the attachments?
I mean, it's usually it gets bundled together, right? So the budget will be like attachment A or attachment B to the contract, and it'll have the payment terms and things like that in there. Now, sometimes there are some payment terms in the body of the CTA, so there are those structures you see as well. But generally, rule of thumb is it's going to be an attachment to the contract, and that's what they are going to be looking at, not the actual main body of the agreement.
Right. And then the other thing I worry about is exactly what you and I discussed, which is, you're right. 99.9% of the time, and I made up that number. I have no idea if that's actually accurate, but the vast majority of times, you don't go back to the contract until something goes wrong. However, do you ever worry about the legal concept of course of dealing? And for those people who don't know what course of dealing is basically, yes, you said all these things in the contract, but we've been doing something different. So the contract's irrelevant because we've been working a different way. So do you ever worry that your contract is becoming null and void because you have your own way of doing things?
It's an interesting question, and it's one that I try to tackle from the perspective of being transparent during negotiations. You know, a lot of the times I have to say, like, it doesn't matter what this section says about how this is going to work. This is how it's actually going to work. So we can pretend like this is how it's going to work, sign the contract, and we're going to be immediately in breach of it. Or we could have the contract reflect what's actually going to happen in the real world. So I do think that that is a concern. And I do try to address it, you know, during the upfront negotiation process and get the contract to reflect reality versus, you know, an ideal scenario that is different. You know, one example I'll bring up is CRF completion timelines, right? There's a lot of language in there that's like, this is how quickly you have to keep a CRF, except if we ask you to do it faster, you'll do it faster. And I'm like, well, that's not really a thing. Like, this is how long it's going to take us. You know, we can pretend like if you ask us to do it faster, we'll do it faster, but we're not going to. So let's just have the contract say it's going to take us 5 days to do it. And so that's, you know, that's how I try to address that is really trying to hone in on making the contract reflect what will actually happen.
That's a really interesting idea, right? And it speaks to the type of resources and the value you bring to the table. And what I mean by that is most people who negotiate these contracts don't actually know how reality works. You're negotiating these contracts in isolation. You're negotiating these contracts with this idea that I'm sure the site can do it. Why can't they do it? You're talking about having an understanding of how your sites actually work. What are their actual SOPs? What are their actual policies? And reality on the ground, your PI is not going to sign. Your PI is going to be traveling. Your PI is busy. Your PI doesn't work on Tuesdays through Thursdays for some apparent reason. So this stuff's not going to happen the way the contract says. And if those situations are accurate, we need to reflect reality. Do sponsors tend to push back?
They do. You know, they want their CRFs as quickly as possible. You know, I think another one where this comes up a lot is record retention, right? There's FDA regulations that speak to record retention, but there's no real reason the site needs to retain those records. The sponsor can retain those records as well, right? And so what is appropriate record retention thing and, you know, timelines? And I think what people don't think about is when you put this language in there that says you have to contact us and get approval before you destroy the records, this is going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And anybody who knew anything about this trial or how it was set up in the beginning is going to be long gone. And so what that process actually looks like on the back end, who knows? I think Pfizer is my favorite one dealing with this topic in a good way, because they actually have like a generic record retention mailbox that you contact to hit that requirement in the contract, right? And so that's kind of one that you could logistically manage, right? But when you have these agreements where all you have in there is a notice section, it's like you have to get approval from us before you destroy the records. It's like, what, I'm going to mail you a letter to the address in the notice section and maybe you get back to me in like 3 years, you know, like what does that actually look like? And another thing I think we don't think about is, does a site actually have a mechanism to ensure that they touch base with the sponsor before destroying the records? Because things like source documents and stuff they're going to keep, but the sites have their own record retention policies, right? So if their record retention policy is we purge after 10 years, is somebody actually going to catch? Well, not this one. We have to go and talk to so-and-so before we purge these records. I don't know the answers to that, you know, these questions, but I think if we just think about it from a common sense lens, you can imagine how sometimes these record retention obligations of notification are probably not being adhered to.
Which really raises the questions of things like, first of all, are these documents ever actually purged? Or are they really being archived electronically? And is an electronic copy good enough? And this becomes even more important when we start thinking about things like GDPR, where you say that, oh, we'll follow XYZ record retention policies and or privacy policies. And this keeps coming up with my US sites where you're having a discussion about record retention and they're going, I'm not following GDPR. I don't have to follow GDPR. You coming in after the fact telling me to do it, I just don't have the mechanisms for it. I'm not going to take on this liability that you want to pass on because you don't know what to do with it. But I think it's an interesting sort of consideration of reality versus what this idealized world will be. Do you find that companies are overall moving towards this, or is it a lot of CYA stuff? For example, you don't want, do you want to be in a situation as a sponsor where you say, oh, you know what, finish the CRFs when you finish them, and we realize reality is different? Or privacy, we understand that you only have XYZ processes available, and therefore we're going to ignore the privacy language. That exposes the sponsor to risk that a site may not be aware of. So what's your take on that?
I think it is mainly a CYA thing, right? Because everybody wants to maintain a good relationship here, okay? Yeah. So it's not a situation where, like, if somebody's not sending you CRFs, you're going to say, I'm terminating the study, we're not going to pay you, and I'm going to sue you for the damages that you've caused us, right? Because you want to do, and especially the larger academic sites that I represent, right? Sponsors are going to want to continue to have a relationship there. The academic sites are invested in having a relationship there. So really, we're all pulling on the same end of the rope. And when there's issues, they get resolved through relationship management and dialogue, more so than pointing at, hey, the contract says that you did 5 days for a CRF. Now, I do think, though, it is important from a CYA perspective, right? Because if I'm a sponsor and the site is habitually not providing CRFs in the timelines they want to, I would want to have contractual recourse to say, we're withholding payment from you until you come into compliance with your reporting requirements, right? So I think, and that is something that you see on a regular basis in terms of payments being impacted because CRFs are delayed, right? And so those type of mechanisms I do think are important from a sponsor perspective to ensure that people are providing them the data that they need in a timely fashion, because, this is important stuff. It goes up into the data safety monitoring boards and the data that they're reporting to the FDA. So it's not like an unimportant thing, right? This is kind of the premise of the entire thing.